You.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris, and good morning, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well on this Thursday morning. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Todd Singh to campus. He's been on the campus of College Station for many years. I think it's in his bio. 20 some years working at College Station. Good guess, right? Seven. Okay. Well, I'm rounding it up to 20.
Yeah, way up.
So how did I meet Dr. Singh? Well, good question. I'm glad you asked because I happened to be on a trip to South Africa pre-COVID, right?
Yeah.
Seems like eons
Right
ago,
before.
but it was only 6 months ago. A trip through the Borlaug Foundation where we were part of an assessment team at the invitation of the South African government to do some work in the area of agriculture. And of course, Dr. Singh was part of that delegation. And so, everywhere we went, we were a group of about 8 to 10 people, but Dr. Singh's reputation preceded him. He's such an engaging speaker, and he's so well internationally renowned in aquaponics that everywhere we went, he got rock star treatment. Nobody wanted to hear the rest of us, they wanted to hear from Dr. Singh. So I figured, well, we should bring him to campus just to kind of stimulate a discussion about aquaponics and perhaps looking at alternative protein sources. Since food security is one of our signature programs, aquaponics may fit in well into that portfolio of enterprises for us to consider, work with underserved audiences. So again, hopefully this will stimulate some thoughts, some ideas, some discussion on the part of us as a land-grant university to have to consider some alternative kinds of production systems that lend themselves to the current environment from a food security perspective. So what else can I say about Dr. Singh? Well, he's got a lot of peer-reviewed publications. He did his PhD at the University of Tennessee. He runs the Aquatic Diagnostics Laboratory at Texas A&M University. And so he's a scholar, a colleague, and a gentleman. So without further ado, let me bring to the stage Dr. Singh.
Thank you, Gerard, for the rock star introduction. I'll try to live up to that as best as I can today. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about aquaponics. And when we talk about aquaponics, most of you are probably familiar with what's referred to as the green revolution of agriculture. Well, in about the last 10 to 15 years, we've really been undergoing what we're calling the blue revolution of agriculture, and that is starting to farm the aquatic environments. And it's not just limited to fish, but we're primarily farming what you would consider traditional row crop vegetables and aquatic systems now, using fish waste as the main fuel source for these systems. Okay, and so today I wanted to give, I know we have all different levels of experience. Some of you are probably very familiar with aquaponics, some may not be familiar at all. Today is going to be a general overview of what is aquaponics, how the systems work together, what systems are composed of, and we'll just start with some of the basics. So the question is, what is aquaponics? And to answer what is aquaponics, we first have to look at the two components of the word. The first half of the word is made up of aquaculture, okay? And so aquaculture is the art and science of growing aquatic organisms. And when we talk about aquatic organisms, we're primarily talking about fish and aquaponics, but we can also be talking about things such as macrobrachium or freshwater shrimp that you might be familiar with, but growing those in a controlled setting in an aquatic environment. Second half of that word is hydroponics. And so when we talk about hydroponics, that's basically growing plants in a soilless medium. And so we use a nutrient solution in an aqueous nutrient solution to grow plants. And so what is aquaponics? Well, aquaponics is It's basically a system that is integrated these two where you use the waste produced by commercial fish production. And historically, when we practice large-scale recirculation aquaculture, that is actually waste that has to be disposed of in some way, and it came at a cost to producers. Well, we can now use that waste as a fuel to feed the plants of the system, and these plants in turn act as a biofilter to filter the water for the fish, and in turn save costs. Real quickly, just a little bit, I want to mention just a little bit about aquaponics in terms of history. So most people, aquaponics is a new current kind of buzzword, but aquaponics has actually been around for more than 4,000 years. There's actually, in Egypt, hieroglyphics depicting tilapia culture in tank systems. What it was is they used to catch undersized fish from rivers and streams. And what do you do when the fish is too small? Well, they would bring them back and throw them in tanks and grow them up. But they didn't have electricity and all these filters and other things that we did back then, right? So how did they clean the water for the fish? Well, they planted edible marsh plants in these systems, and those acted as the filter for the fish. It dates back almost 2,000 years in China. So it's not a new thing. Aquaponics has been around for a very long time. It's really started to see a revival in the late 80s, and now in the early 2000s, it's really started to pick up steam and gain a lot of attention. So when we talk about waste stream, in aquaculture, the fish produce nitrogenous and mineral waste as a byproduct of normal protein metabolism, right? So that requires filtration systems. And so when we talk about aquaculture, our filtration systems can be quite large, quite complex, very expensive, and still those filtration systems have to be cleaned out to remove solid waste, and that has to be disposed of somewhere. It also doesn't account for the dissolved inorganic solids, that waste that has to be removed. Hydroponics, we use chemical fertilizers to provide nutrients to the plant. One of the issues with this is it actually requires regular flushing of those hydroponic systems because you have to replenish the nutrients as the plants take them up, and salts build up in those systems over time, which can damage the plants. And so what this regular flushing does, in addition to adding time, cost, and labor, well, it's wasting water. And we all know how critical water resources are right now, so we don't want to waste water. Well, in aquaponics, the ammonia that is excreted by fish, that's their primary waste product, it is converted by bacteria to nitrate. And so nitrifying bacteria are what does that nitrification conversion. And so the nitrate is the usable form that can be uptaken by plants. Okay? So basically, when we walk around our system, our plants act as our filtration system. That improves the water quality for our fish. The fish, the nitrifying bacteria, and the plants all benefit each other. So the fish is the source of nutrients for the system. The nitrifying bacteria convert fish waste to usable nutrients for the plant, and the plants filter nutrients from the water to benefit the fish. We're basically creating a combined ecosystem. In fish culture, we're not creating an entire ecosystem, right? We're having to synthetically remove those waste streams and stuff. It's not a complete ecosystem. Here, it's all one self-contained ecosystem that feeds each other, and so it actually takes care of itself. Okay? So what are some of the benefits of aquaponics? Well, in terms of the fish production, we have greatly reduced cost because we're reducing all that money of waste filtration, all the backwashing, all the mechanical parts that we have to purchase, all those filters and electricity. Okay? In terms of the plants, we're benefiting because we're no longer having to pay for inorganic fertilizers or fertilizer management, and Like I said, because we're reducing that flushing of the system, we're reducing water waste. And one of the greatest benefits to humans outside the system is it's all 100% organic. For most people, they know about organic plants. It took us almost 20 years to get the FDA to approve it, but about 3 years ago, we actually got through the organic approval process for fish. Fish can be certified organically grown without chemicals. And so in terms of bringing a higher market price, that jumps the value up, but it also benefits people on that they know how their food was grown, they know that nothing else went into it that may be harmful to them.
Excuse me, we're not seeing the slides.
You're not seeing the slides? Okay.
No.
Share screen, share.
We see them now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Somebody should tell me that a little sooner. All right. Now, another big advantage is it's very fast, efficient food production. When we're talking about lettuce production, we're talking about going from a seedling transplant to a head of lettuce in 30 days. Some systems, like the commercial system down at Hockley, has it down to as little as 25 days for a fully formed head of lettuce. We're producing tremendous amounts of produce in a very small space. Like we were talking earlier, you can have up to 25 heads of lettuce per square meter. And so very high density, very fast growth. What it also does, thank you. Well, what it also does is we use traditionally only about 10% of the water required to produce a crop that you would in traditional row crop agriculture. So far less water consumption. And of course, like I said, we already have less filtration and equipment cost. So one of the biggest benefits of aquaponics, and most people that buy fresh vegetables from the grocery store will not realize this, the plants are alive. When you're buying or from aquaponics, the plants are still alive when you purchase them. When you buy a piece of produce from the store, for example, your head of lettuce, those roots have been cut off and that plant is essentially dying from the time those plants are removed. Well, in aquaponics, they're harvested with the root system intact. And so as you can see in these images, I'll use the mouse here. So these are the root systems and these are the growing cups that are in. You can simply fold that root system up around the cup. They grab a little plastic bag around it to keep the roots moist. And so those plants remain alive while they're being marketed and sold, transported. And so we have actually done experiments here where we've placed plants in refrigeration for up to 2 weeks. So you basically buy a plant, take it home, put it in your refrigerator. After 2 weeks, we can take it out, plant it in the garden, and it re-roots and it grows and it's still alive. So we have produce that is lasting much longer, and that reduces food waste. We're not throwing out as much fresh produce that goes bad. And so that's a great benefit to restaurants. Think about food banks, about how much food is thrown out in the U.S. every year. So that's one of the great things about aquaponics. Okay, so in terms of what goes into an aquaponics system, what are the inputs? Well, an aquaponics system is pretty simple. It requires water, fish feed, electricity, and air pumps, and light. Okay? Now, there's a lot of small-scale hobby hydroponic systems around the U.S. And if you're interested in aquaponics, one of the beautiful things, or even a commercial scale, it's very easy to convert from existing hydroponic operations to aquaponic operations. Basically, you just have to add a filtration tank or a filter, a fish tank, and some extra plumbing, and you're going from hydroponics to aquaponics very quickly. Now, the one component of the system that is traditionally ignored by most people, and most people know very little about it, is the nitrifying bacteria. But it's the most critical or crucial part of the system. And if you are going to run an aquaponic system, basically what you're doing is managing bacteria full time. Without the nitrifying bacteria, the entire system doesn't work because those waste products are not converted from the fish to a usable form for the plants, and therefore no filtration is taking place. Okay? So there's basically two different genera of nitrifying bacteria, and the nitrification process takes place in two stages. And so what we want to think about is oftentimes aquaponics producers think about fish running the system. Well, I want you to change that thinking and think about the fish are producing the fuel to run the system. The bacteria are the engine that runs the system. Okay, without the engine or without the fuel, it's not going to operate correctly. And so all of our daily maintenance in aquaponics centers around maintaining an optimal environment for those bacteria. And so what that basically means is our daily water quality testing. And what we're doing is we're measuring the concentrations of ammonia and nitrite in the water to make sure that that nitrification process is occurring and we're not building up at any one stage. If you're building up too much ammonia or too much nitrite, that means one of those bacterial populations is crashing and you're not getting efficient conversion. Okay, so let's talk about our nitrifying bacteria. Our two genera are Nitrus ammonis and Nitrobacter. And so Nitrus ammonis converts ammonia to nitrite. Now, ammonia is the waste product from fish. It's highly toxic to fish. It's one of the first things that's going to kill a fish in a confined system. Okay? Nitrite, after that first conversion, is slightly less toxic to fish, but it's still toxic form. So you still need the Nitrobacter, which converts nitrite to nitrate, and nitrate is relatively non-toxic to fish. Most fish can tolerate around 80 parts per million, but if they build up in the system over time, we have some species that we've had as high as 160 parts per million nitrate, and with no ill effects. Now, why is that important? The nitrate is the usable form that is most readily uptaken by the plants. So, in terms of nitrification, our ammonia, like I said, is a normal product of protein metabolism. Most people don't realize it. They think fish, in terms of other animals, that most of our nitrogen waste comes from our urine. Well, that doesn't occur in freshwater fish. It mainly comes from the gills. It's transferred across the gill membranes. There is a little bit in the feces. Like I said, excessive ammonia is toxic to fish, but we have to think about in an aqueous solution in water, ammonia occurs in ammonia and ammonium. And so there's a balance. And so that unionized ammonia is what is toxic to fish. Ionized ammonia is non-toxic. And so how do we determine the amount of unionized ammonia present in water? Well, it's a simple equation. It's a conversion between the total ammonia nitrogen present, the temperature, and the pH of the water. So you can have 1 part per million ammonia in water and it be non-toxic to fish at a pH of 9 and a temperature of 22 degrees. Now we drop that pH down to 7, or we increase that temperature, and that 1 part per million that was non-toxic to them suddenly becomes unionized, and now it's toxic to all your fish. So checking our pH is very critical in terms of maintaining our systems. So, basically, I just said all that without giving you the slides. So all those commits I get ahead of myself sometimes on these because I get to talking so fast. So in terms of our aquaponic system, what are the biotic or the living components of the system? Well, like I said, it's our fish, our plants, and our bacteria. They're all working in unison together. And what are the abiotic components, okay? Those other components of the system. So we have our fish tanks, our clarifier or solid waste filtration tank, biofilter, the plant growing beds or troughs, a water pump, and an air pump. We'll talk a little bit more about the water pump in a minute. There are some system configurations where you can use airlift, so you do not need a water pump. The air pump alone can drive the entire system. And aquaponic systems are just about all set up gravity feed. So it requires not big giant pumps like we use in commercial culture where we're driving liquids through filters. Basically very small pumps that can just return water up to the head tank, which is the fish tank, and then it all gravity flows back down. So a very small pump can run a very large system, very energy efficient. Okay, so there's many different designs that can be employed. We'll have everything in these slides from big commercial systems that you might have seen. This is a very common backyard system setup using IDC totes. This uses a media bed. Basically, you have a fish tank down below, a media bed with the plants up above, a simple pump that just runs water up, and it's a drain and flood cycle. You even have these. You can buy small-scale aquariums from 1 gallon up to 50 gallons to set in your home that you can grow herbs up above while you watch your ornamental fish for stress control down below. Now, you're probably not going to be growing much protein in terms of food eating, but it's a way that if you like to have fish, you can grow some food from your own aquarium. Okay? So, when we talk about system components, we talk about density of fish. Okay? If we're going to grow low density fish, the system can be very simple. It can consist of as little as a fish tank and a grow trough, like this simple backyard. The higher density fish that you want to produce, in other words, the more fish that you want to pack into a tank, the more components that are going to be required because there's going to be additional stages of filtration and solids removal that you're going to have to go through. So, finally, in addition to those other components that we talked about, some commercial systems use a base addition tank. Remember we talked about the pH of the system being very critical in terms of ammonia and bacterial health? Well, the alkalinity and the pH of aquaponics tends to decrease over time as nitrification occurs and as fish use that alkalinity for growth. And so you're constantly having to add bases to the system to bring the pH back up. Adding a base to a system and causing a rapid pH change will kill all your fish, and that's why we keep a separate base addition tank. Another thing that you may see on some large commercial systems or very large home systems is oftentimes we'll have a fish treatment tank. Eventually, if you're doing aquaponics, you will get sick fish. Now, you may have several years before it happens, or it may be year to year, but if you get sick fish and you want to treat them, you cannot treat them in your system because now it's no longer organic production, right? You've just ruined your plants because even though you're treating your fish, that water circulates through and you're exposing your plants to chemicals. Well, we want to have a fish isolation system so that we can move those fish over and treat them safely separately from the system so that we don't ruin the organic. Okay. Talking through our system components real quick. Fish tanks, I put it on there even though it's pretty obvious. Fish tanks are where the fish are housed. That's where it's kept. Any properly designed system is usually going to have 2 tanks. Now, larger commercial systems are typically going to have 4 or more tanks, but we strongly encourage at least 2 tanks, even for home systems. And the reason for that is pretty simple, and it has to do with both managing. Someone's not on mute.
Can you the most? Can you unmute? Yeah, mute. Yeah, that's it.
All right. Back to our 2 tanks. One is some species of fish that you grow are cannibalistic. And if you have different sizes of fish in your tanks, well, then you're obviously going to have cannibalism. So keeping 2 different size classes of fish in separate tanks is just very efficient in terms of reducing cannibalism. However, the biggest benefit comes in terms of harvesting. When you're doing aquaponics and you have to get into a tank and handle fish, you want to handle them as little as possible. Every time you touch a fish, it removes their slime coat, which opens them to bacteria. Bacteria in the aquatic system are a couple hundred-fold higher than they are in a terrestrial system in air. Okay? The aquatic environment is just a breeding ground for bacteria. And so they're going to get sick. So you don't want to be constantly sorting through your fish to remove larger ones and return smaller ones. So you want to have a very efficient harvest system where you basically go in and harvest an entire tank at once. If you go in and harvest an entire tank at once and you only have 1 tank, you've just removed your nutrient production for your plants, and so you have to shut down your system until you can cycle again. Okay? So you don't want to do that. You always want to have a different one. 2 tanks, you harvest 1 system, or 1 tank. It could be done quickly and efficiently. Your fish in the other tank are still producing nutrients, still running that system while you restock your other tank. Once you restock your other tank, you harvest the remaining tank. Okay? And so let's just run through a quick example. So imagine you had 2 fish tanks. And so 1 tank is stocked with fingerlings. And fingerlings is a fish term that's used to represent, it was back in the old days, fish about the size of your finger. When you hear fingerlings, basically it just means juvenile fish, non-mature. So in this case, we have 1 tank stocked with small fish, or fingerlings, and we have 1 tank stocked with half-pound fish. Okay? Because we always want to have a crop. We want to get a couple crops a year to harvest to have income from that system. So now imagine 6 months down the road, our fish have grown. Our larger fish that we started with are now about 1 pound, and we're going to harvest all of them. Okay? Well, the fish that were fingerlings then are now all about 1/2 pound. So when you harvest your big fish and then restock that tank that you just harvested with new fish, now you're right back to where you started from initially in terms of fish biomass and production. Okay? Typically, in aquaponics systems, depending on the size of troughs or grow beds that you're trying to fuel, in other words, how much plant production you want, our fish tanks are usually really not that big. Anywhere from 100 gallons to 1,500 gallons. To give you an example, commercial fish tanks will run from 20,000 to 50,000 gallons. So we're using very small tanks. It takes very few fish to produce enough nutrient to grow a lot of plants. And in these tanks, we're really not stocking very high densities either. We're still doing fairly low production. So what types of fish do we typically grow in aquaponics? What are good candidate species? Well, we always get a lot of people that want to grow marine species, high value fish, like red drum or flounder or something. We get this all the time. I can tell you right now, we cannot grow any marine species in aquaponics. Okay, salts kill plants. And so you just can't do it. And so we're not talking about any marine species. Our good choices are tilapia, hybrid striped bass, koi. Even down here in Texas, we do cold crop rotation with rainbow trout and tilapia. So this tend to be more outdoor systems. Not everyone has a greenhouse, and so we'll grow a warm season crop. Our lettuce and other peppers, things like that, warm season growing crops. We'll grow tilapia, which takes about 6 months to get a harvest production crop. Then we'll switch over to our winter or cool season crops, things like broccoli and other things that grow well during the winter. And we'll buy what we call advanced rainbow trout. They'll be about 6 to 8 inches in size. Put them in there. In 6 months, we'll be ready to harvest them. They'll be about 12 to 14 inches in size and about a pound and a half. And so you can get 2 different production. Now, I will tell you in terms of fish, in aquaponics, tilapia is king. Why is tilapia king? Because you can get 2 crops a year out of an aquaponics system. You can go from your fingerlings introduced to 1.25 pounds, 1.5 pounds fish in 6 months. So you get 2 crops every 6 months. The rest of our species, most of them are going to take 16 to 24 months to produce a crop. That means you have limited cash flow while that's coming in. The reason why it works is because those are higher value species, so we're going to get higher return, whereas tilapia are very low value species. You don't get a lot of money or profit return from those. Poor choices that we see people try to use all the time, catfish. People think, well, catfish, we do a lot of catfishing culture and they would be a good choice. That's simply not true. Catfish do not do well in small tanks. After they get to about 1/4 pound, they become territorial, and the largest fish in the tanks try to establish a territory, and they attack the rest of the fish in the tank, which tears them up, opens them up, and you always end up with these big disease outbreaks, and then I get calls, all my fish died. Catfish in small tanks, not a great choice. Bluegill or other sunfish, yes, they're good to eat, they're high value, but they have horrible feed conversion. Like tilapia, we can get about 1.2, 1.3 pounds of feed per pound of game. Bluegill, we're getting about 4 pounds of feed per pound of game. So really not good feed conversion. Plus they have a very slow growth rate. You're going to be looking at a minimum of 24 months to get a harvestable size fish out of it. Goldfish typically cost more to feed than their actual sale value. Okay, so in one study that we did, you run 6 months of goldfish for growth, and you determine the cost of the feed, and it actually costs about 2.5 times more than what you could buy them at PetSmart for. So what are you going to do with your product once you've got it to a larger size? There's no income. I will go back just real quick. Koi, people say, well, what's the difference between koi and goldfish? And in terms of koi production, sales are really sporadic, spotty. But when we're talking about larger koi, like 2 to 3 pound koi, they can fetch anywhere between $50 and $250 for a common pond run fish. These are people that want them for backyard ornamental gardens. They're willing to pay for large fish. If you've been to PetSmart, Petco, anywhere like that, a 4-inch koi will run you about $8 to $9. Now, you can't buy these big ones just anywhere. And so, like I said, sales are going to be sporadic, and usually when people buy them, it's going to be 5 or 6 at a time. But when you're getting $150 for each one of those 5 or 6 fish, you're suddenly turning a great deal of profit in terms of what feed's going into it. Goldfish just don't work out because no one pays high dollar for a big goldfish. Moving on to the next component of our system is our solid waste filtration. We have to remove solids from our system because if they don't, they accumulate in areas of the system and create anoxic zones, okay? Zones with no oxygen in them. And what happens there is we actually get heterotrophic bacteria growing in that will outcompete our nitrifying bacteria. Plus, we also get all kinds of nasty chemical production like sulfur dioxide and methane, which can be toxic to your fish and your plants. Okay, so there's different names that these go by. Sometimes they're called clarifiers, other times radial flow filters, swirl filters, solid settling tanks, clarifiers. They have all different types of names. Usually they're partitioned. This is just an example of a partitioned clarifier tank. And so the main function of these is basically just to separate the solid waste from the dissolved nutrients in the water. And how they function is basically they slow down water flow or they break up water flow in order to increase retention time and allow those solids time to settle out. They can then be drained out of the bottom of the conical shaped tank. I was talking earlier to someone, this is kind of more the traditional organic way that aquaponics has grown in. What we've done with our commercial scale system is we've actually started taking more of the technology from commercial aquaculture and started incorporating that into our demonstration systems. And so rather than using these antiquated radial flow filters and things that you have to have a lot of equipment, a lot of floor space, we're actually going to things like bead filters and stratified partition filters that you can automatically backwash and reduces space use, much more efficient. So we're starting to move that direction. Technology is now starting to be more and more incorporated into this.
What do you do with the backwash water?
Okay, so that's what I'm actually talking about right here. So our solid waste and our backwash water that you're talking about is not truly waste, okay? It's still extremely rich in nutrients and it should be used efficiently. And so how do we use it efficiently? Well, if we take that solid waste and we aerate it for several days in our backwash water, well, then we run it through small mesh filters, and you can do two options. You can either make what's called a compost tea, basically by aerating it, that creates oxygen in there and allows bacterial breakdown of that organic nutrient, releasing the dissolved minerals into it. And so you can make what's called a compost tea, which can be added back to your aquaponics system as a fertilizer. Okay. The other is we compost it and we put it back into row crops or gardens back in an organic garden, and it will grow the heck out of crops. There's still a lot of nutrients that those plants in that system don't absorb, and so we get really good garden growth when we use it as fertilizer. The other thing is we can also add it to vermiculture bins or grow beds, and so most people don't realize that one of the big things in media beds is we actually use worms. And these are traditional earthworms or redworms that are in the grow bed. And yes, they live underwater as long as that water is oxygenated, and it has to be for your plants and fish. They're in there eating and digesting all that solid waste. And so they're actually acting as a filter, breaking that down and further processing those nutrients. But what do you do with worms? Well, you can actually sell these, and night crawler production is quite profitable. If you look at extension across any state here in the U.S., you will find they all have production guides on earthworm production. Yes, Texas A&M has its own production guide on earthworm production because it can be very profitable. You sell them for the fishing industry. So it's a byproduct that you can use.
That they use on the composting too for vermiculture?
We don't use them in the composting because the composting usually gets so hot that it's detrimental for the worms, but we do use them in the grow beds. Now, after it's already composted, you can use that compost as a nutrient-rich food for the worms, but they're usually growing in long wooden boxes in dark rooms. All right. Our next component is our biofilter, and our biofilter is where our large populations of our nitrifying bacteria are housed. And so what is inside our biofilters are just high surface area inert materials, okay? They're non-porous materials. I was going to say, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to skip ahead. But so like these are some of the materials here. So you can use simple things like nylon or PVC netting, polyethylene filter pads, which are these, biomatrix pads. We even use sand. Common sand filter that you use in your pool. Sand has extremely high surface area. We've kind of refined that in aquaculture, though. We've moved away from sand and we've gone to polyester beads. And so that's what these are. It's just a larger grain of sand. It's much less dense, so it's easier to backwash in those filters. They don't get clogged as easy. Bio balls, which are these little critters up here, or bio barrels, which are these. These are just all different shapes that have super high surface area that allow lots of site for bacterial attachment. And so in our biofilter is where the primary majority of that ammonia produced by the fish is going to be processed to nitrate and then to nitrite and then nitrate. Now, the nitrifying bacteria will attach everywhere in your system, everywhere where there's contact with water. So they'll even be growing on your plant roots, on the underside of your rafts, on your tank walls. You'll look at it and it looks kind of like a brown film, and if you just rub your hand along and it comes up as this kind of brown is. That's all nitrifying bacteria. But despite all of that, your biofilter is still where most of your nitrification occurs. And
Is it because of the large surface area?
the large surface area, even though, yeah, you think you got a big grow bed and lots of area on that, and you think, oh, this is a large area, but in terms of a couple handfuls of sand might have the same surface area as your entire grow bed. So when you multiply that multiple times in your biofilter, it's just the attachment area. There's so much more area for them to grow. All right. And so I just basically said that once again. I get ahead of myself. I get too excited when I talk about these and I get going really fast, get ahead of myself. So some systems also use media beds as biosolids digestion. And so these are examples of media beds. And those are the areas where we were talking about where you would have worm production. And so basically the water would come out of your biofilter or your fish tank and go directly into your media bed. In your media bed, as the water flows through, all those solids are caught up in the substrate. And so then your worms are in there burrowing and tunneling around through your substrate, eating that material and digesting it. Oh, the other great thing about using those is it's not wasted space. So this is an empty one, but what you can actually do is they're also great places to grow plants, so it's not wasted space. You have a filter that is working as a filter, but it's also producing worms, and you can also plant it to grow additional plants. The base addition tank, like we said, this serves as a place to add water amendments. It's not necessarily always bases. Sometimes we do have to add other things to the system, like occasionally you might have to add calcium if you're producing plants that require high calcium to prevent bloom rot. The ones that jump to mind are like peppers and tomatoes. And so some of the sources of carbonates that we add are calcium carbonate, calcium hydroxide, calcium oxide, potassium bicarbonate. Basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to always keep that pH somewhere near neutral. Once we start creeping up above 7.5, plants are less efficient at taking up nutrients. But we also don't want to fall too low because our nitrification stops at about 6.5 and our bacteria will actually die about 6. So we got a very narrow range in terms of pH where we want to maintain that system. Another thing for people that don't want to use chemicals and want to keep it more organic, oftentimes they use bags of crushed oyster shell hung in the water. As the water acidifies, those acids in the water work with the calcium in the oyster shell and break it down, and it actually maintains the pH in the system. Works great for small hobby scale, say systems the size of this room. Anything much larger than that, it just doesn't break down fast enough to keep. So in more commercial scale, you're going to have to go back to your base edition. Okay, so now we move on to our growing methods, and there's 3 primary methods used in aquaponics production. The first are our media beds. And media beds are filled with inert media. And so typically these are expanded clay pellets or pH neutral rock. They're operated using a flood and drain cycle. And so what that means is the media beds are slowly filled with water over a 20-minute period. And then a float valve activates when the bed is full, and a bell siphon takes over, and it sucks all the water out over about a 10-minute period. And so that's your drain mechanism. And so what it is, the continuous drain and flood cycle guarantees that the plant roots never become too wet. They're not submerged for too long, but yet they still have periods where they're exposed to air, so they get plenty of oxygen to them. Okay. In media beds, some of the advantages of a media bed, we can grow those larger plants. In deep water raft culture or NFT that we'll talk about in a minute, those are really good for herbs, lettuce, things of that nature. But if we're trying to grow things like tomatoes, cucumbers, large plants with big rooting systems, they don't really have that support. Media beds have that substrate so you can grow the larger plants in it. So some examples, like I said, these are the expanded clay pellets. Lava rock is another type that you can use. Some of the disadvantages to media beds, they can become clogged easily. And so that means that they have to be cleaned frequently, a minimum of 2 times a year. And what that means is you have to shovel tons of rock or clay out of these systems and wash them all and move them back. So it can be very labor intensive. Another drawback is a lot of clay pellets and some of these other things are very expensive. So people are always trying to get by with cheaper stuff. They try to use things like river rock and those types of things. The issue is if it contains any limestone at all, it will throw the pH and the alkalinity of your system all off. You can never maintain it. And so one quick test is before you ever use any type of rock or stone in a system, drop it in some vinegar and see if it bubbles. If it bubbles, it has calcium carbonate or another base in there. You cannot use it in an aquaponics system. No matter how well you wash it, it's just not going to work. The second growing technique is the nutrient film technique. This is a technique that is primarily used in hydroponics right now. And so in this technique, thin sheet of water is continually run through channels or gutters, and the plants are placed in holes in the top of the channel or gutter, and the roots grow down into this thin film of water. So the great thing about the nutrient film system, you don't need an air pump. No additional aeration is needed because the water is constantly flowing, and in a thin film, it's always well oxygenated. And because inside these channels, most of that space that the roots are exposed to is actually air, but it's very high humid air, so they don't dry out, so they get plenty of oxygen. This type of system works really good for small plants such as leafy greens or lettuces and things. You don't tend to want to grow plants with large root systems in these because once that large root system develops, they basically block up the channel and water can no longer flow and you start having clogging issues. Another big disadvantage is because you're using a small volume of water pumping constantly and it's a very thin sheet, that water can warm up very quickly and very easily. And so if you're growing temperature sensitive things like lettuce, like that likes cooler temperatures, especially on large scale systems, oftentimes you will have to add a chiller, especially during the summer months in order to keep that water cool enough to keep crops growing. Our third and last method is our deep water raft culture system. This is by far the most popular and most proven system. I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 90 to 95% of all commercial scale aquaponic systems are deep water raft culture systems. This by far produces the most food and the most fish, and it's the most efficient. So in these deep water raft culture systems, basically what this is if you see in the image, I'll try and highlight here with the arrow, this is basically just foam board with holes cut in it. And the troughs are just these deep, long, water-filled bodies. You float the styrofoam wrapped on top, you put the plants in the hole, the roots hang down and are exposed to the system. And so you actually stage your crops from youngest to oldest. And so you put them in at one end, or so basically, let me back up. You got some at the far end that's ready to harvest. You pull out a board, you take it to the harvest table. At the near end, you just slide in a new board. They all just float right down, and you keep your production line moving that way. Okay. So this one does need a lot of aeration. Aeration is supplied not just to the fish in the tanks, but the entire length of these grow beds. There are air stones underneath that are providing aeration to keep those plant roots aerated. In deep water raft culture, the troughs typically vary between 6 and 24 inches deep. I would personally never go as shallow as 6 inches. The standard kind of across the industry is about 18 inches. That allows enough room for most roots to grow, but still leaves a little bit below the bottom of mature plants that water can still flow pretty easily and uninterrupted. You go down to 6 to 12 inches, you got a chance the same as the deep or the nutrient film technique. Those roots can actually clog it up and block the flow if you're getting too shallow with it. So deep water raft culture is very good. Around time. Very good, especially for crops specializing in leafy greens such as lettuce and kale. Okay, so in aquaponics system design, a typical aquaponics system, like I said, is going to be flow through. The fish tanks are the highest point in terms of the water level. The water is going to cascade from your fish tank to your clarifier, to your biofilter, to your supplemental aeration tank if you have one, to your grow trough. And so these are Joe Masabni with Horticulture Extension up at Overton. We do aquaponics workshops together. This is a picture of his system up in his greenhouse. And so we just basically have our flow down from our fish tanks to our clarifiers to our biofilters, and then on this side is trough. So gravity flow systems. Okay. The water pump, we do want to make sure that you have enough pump to push water back up to the fish tank. And so, like I said earlier, they can be very small pumps because you're only pumping a few feet of head. And so, when we talk about our water pumps, a single pump is usually all that is required for an aquaponic system if it's set up correctly with gravity flow. Like I said, airlift systems, which basically use a larger blower rather than a linear compressor like you would for most. They'll use a larger linear blower, and it actually blows air through a pipe, and that air moving through the pipe actually takes a volume of water with it. And so you can use a single blower to power not only your aeration, but your water return back to your head tank. So you don't need a separate water pump. It's advantageous because it's more energy efficient. You don't have to buy as much equipment. Here's the issue though. If your blower goes out, now you have no water circulation and you have no air. If you have a blower or an air pump and a water pump, if your water pump goes out, you still have aeration going to your fish and your plants. Buys you time. If your Aeration goes out, your water pump is still working, and so all that cascading down the system's adding oxygen, so it buys you some time, right? And so it's better to have both.
Or redundancy too.
What's that?
Or redundancy in your system.
Redundancy is always good. A lot of people starting out can't afford redundancy, but you're right. We usually have two blowers on every system, 2 water pumps. Redundancy is very good. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is remember that your pumping rate is reduced by your head height. And so a lot of people will buy a pump based on what they think they can circulate around their system, but then they don't account for head height. So make sure to check your pumping rate on your pump that you purchased to make sure that it can produce the gallon of flow rate that you want to circulate your system. And Gerard's inching up on me, so I take that as a sign. I'll be quiet now and answer questions if anyone has any.
I think I'm a little bit hesitant to talk about economics while we have economists around the room. So, but I think the profitability of a system, etc. If you can expand a little bit on that.
I didn't get there because I ran out of time. Yeah. So economics, okay? So there's a couple of issues in terms of dealing with economics and aquaponics. Most people, don't consider fish as part of their business plan. They think of it's just there generating nutrients, but you're going to fail immediately if you do that. It is truly a 2-crop production system. Your fish are there for production. You sell your fish. The fish cover the price, the cost of the feed, the electricity, and the depreciation on equipment. By doing that, then your plants that you sell are pure profit based on that. If you're only selling plants and trying to cover the entire system cost, it's very difficult and you usually can't do it. The other thing that I want to point out is there's a common misconception that's often marketed by people that aquaponics is cheaper than hydroponics. That is not true at all. When we've done some of the studies that we've looked at, when you take 1 ton of 32% protein fish feed, it costs us about $485 a ton. That's if you're buying in bulk by 20-ton rail car. Most of you aren't buying that. You're paying much more for a 40-pound bag. Well, that supplies 305 pounds of nitrate by the time it's cycled through a hybrid striped bass. That's what you get. Well, that exact same amount of nitrate applied from urea and hydroponics, only $107. It cost you 4 times the amount of money to get that same amount of nutrient. So if you're not considering the fish as a crop to cover cost, then the economics gets very difficult. Any other questions?
I have a question. So about the plant nutrients, you talked about nitrogen only. Does the system supply all the other nutrients that are needed by the plants? And the second question is, do the plants pick some flavor or smell from the tank or from the system based on maybe fish type? And the third question is, can the fish and also the plants can be certified as organic? These are 3 questions. Thank you.
So how can the fish and plants be certified as organic? So the USD actually has organic certification standards. You can actually print them off online. And so in terms of the fish, you basically have a checkoff system that is self-reported. And so
I mean, based on what chemicals you use in the system, do you think?
Based on what chemicals are used in the system? Yes. So there is a very, very long list of what can and cannot be used. So some of the things that we were talking about, like the bases, you can use bases. You can add some plant fertilizers. But there's also what a lot of people don't think about. In your fish, you also have to buy organic fish feed. Okay, you can't just feed regular fish feed. You have to buy organic fish feed to feed to the fish in order for it to be certified organic. Regular fish feeds will contain things like poultry byproduct meal, meat and bone meal, and some of those can't be fed to fish in order to be certified organic. I had a hard time hearing what was your other question?
The other question is that the plants, do they pick some flavor or smell from the fish tank, depending on the fish tank?
No, not at all. There's a matter of fact, this is one of those things that's very difficult to quantify because it's all subjective, right? But
Yes.
the majority of people say that they think produce growing both aquaponically or hydroponically has better flavor than traditional earth grown row crop. Can that be proven? No, it's a matter of personal preference, but I've never heard anyone say that there's any type of fishy flavor or anything from the fish.
You said it converted it to nitrate.
But yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's all been waste. It's been through filtration and stuff. So the plants are never directly exposed to the fish at any point in time.
Through the water, maybe. And the third question is
Well,
maybe
if I may, since it's noon, if anyone
Okay.
needs to leave, we're gonna go ahead and excuse them. And then Dr. Cabron, you're welcome to stick around, either
Okay.
online or in person, and we can continue this discussion. But let's give Dr. Sink a big hand. So he's an extremely busy individual. It took me several months to book him, as it were, and we were trying to do this in March or April, soon after our return from South Africa, but COVID intervened, so we finally worked out his date. And to thank him, a small token of appreciation, since he's from off campus, he traveled all the way over here, and he's spending half a day, visited the farm, a tour of our facilities and so on, and of course, most importantly, for sharing his expertise. A small token of appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Very good church. So
awesome. It's a nice shirt too. I thought it was gonna be like a t-shirt. I should have known that's not Gerard's style. I mean, he's got style.
It's better than regular iPhone.
All right. So thanks again.
No comment. He's gonna try and get me in trouble.
And welcome to stick around. Dr. Sink will be with us for another hour or so. So welcome to stick around. And Dr. Cabron, we look forward to your questions. And thanks everybody. Stay safe and take care.
Any questions?
Well, I mean, it's a whole course. It's a whole. Thank you for giving a good overview.
And so that was just a basic overview, and I knew that. And so one thing that we talked about on our trip with Gerard, I would like to